The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the weathered general store, and Ruby Dawson stepped down into the dust of North Platte, Nebraska, clutching a faded photograph so tightly that the edges had begun to crease beneath her fingers. The year was 1878, and the wind carried with it the scent of cattle and prairie grass, mixed with the promise of rain that never seemed to come. Ruby stood there for a moment, her dark blue traveling dress already coated in a fine layer of dust from the journey, her auburn hair escaping its pins despite her best efforts. She was 22 years old, alone, and holding the only link she had to a family she had never known. The photograph showed a woman with kind eyes standing beside a man in front of what appeared to be a ranch house. On the back, written in fading ink, were the words, "Your mother, Sarah Dawson, North Platte, Nebraska, 1858. Ruby had found it tucked into the Bible of the woman who had raised her in an orphanage in Philadelphia. Mrs. Patterson had been dead for 3 months now, and with her passing, Ruby had lost the only person who might have been able to tell her more about where she came from. The main street of North Platte stretched out before her, lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean toward each other as if sharing secrets. A saloon at one end, the general store where she stood, a bank, a boarding house, and various other establishments that made up the backbone of this frontier town. Cowboys and ranchers moved along the wooden sidewalks, their spurs jingling with each step. A few women in bonnets hurried past, eyeing her with curiosity. Ruby took a deep breath and headed toward the general store. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and a portly man with spectacles looked up from behind the counter. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his tone friendly enough. "I hope so," Ruby said, approaching the counter and carefully placing the photograph down. "I am looking for information about this woman, Sarah Dawson. The photograph says it was taken here in North Platte 20 years ago." The shopkeeper leaned forward, studying the image with a frown. "Dawson," he murmured. "That name rings a bell, but I only came to North Platte 15 years ago myself. Sarah Dawson." He shook his head slowly. "There was talk of a woman by that name who passed away in childbirth, must be nearing 23 years ago now. Tragic story as I heard it." Ruby felt her heart sink and race at the same time. Passed away in childbirth. Could that have been her own birth? "You know what happened to the child?" Ruby asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am afraid I do not know much, miss. Just old gossip and rumors." "You might want to talk to some of the older folks around town, or perhaps head out to the Lambert ranch. Graham Lambert has been here his whole life. His father knew just about everyone in these parts before he passed." "The Lambert ranch," Ruby repeated. "Where would I find it?" The shopkeeper gave her directions, pointing west out of town. "It is about 5 miles out. You cannot miss it. Big spread with a stone fence along the front. Graham runs it alone now after his father died 2 years back. Keeps to himself mostly, but he is a decent man. If anyone can help you, it might be him." Ruby thanked him and stepped back out into the bright afternoon sun. 5 miles was not an impossible distance, but she had no horse and her feet were already sore from walking around Philadelphia for weeks, settling Mrs. Patterson's affairs. She made her way to the livery stable, where a grizzled old man agreed to rent her a gentle mare for a reasonable price. "You sure you know how to ride, miss?" he asked, eyeing her city dress skeptically. "Well enough," Ruby assured him, though in truth she had only ridden a handful of times in her life. The mare was patient with her, and Ruby managed to mount without too much difficulty. She secured her small carpet bag behind the saddle and set off westward, following the shopkeeper's directions. The prairie stretched out around her, vast and intimidating in its emptiness. Back in Philadelphia, Ruby had never been able to see more than a block or two ahead, the buildings and people always crowding in. Here, the land seemed to go on forever, the sky impossibly large above her. The late afternoon sun beat down on her shoulders as she rode, and she was grateful when she finally spotted the stone fence the shopkeeper had mentioned. Beyond it, she could see a well-maintained ranch with a sturdy two-story house, a large barn, and several outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, and the whole property had an air of quiet prosperity about it. Ruby guided the mare up the long drive, her heart pounding. What would she say? How did one approach a stranger and ask about a mother one had never known? A man emerged from the barn as she approached, wiping his hands on his work pants. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of beard shadowing his jaw. He could not have been much older than 30, Ruby estimated, and there was a wariness in his gray eyes as he watched her approach. "Can I help you?" he called out, his voice deep and measured. Ruby dismounted, grateful to have her feet back on solid ground, even if her legs felt shaky. "I am looking for Graham Lambert," she said. "You found him." He walked closer, but stopped a respectful distance away. There was something careful in the way he moved, as if he was used to being alone and found the presence of another person slightly uncomfortable. "My name is Ruby Dawson," she said, pulling the photograph from her pocket. "I came from Philadelphia looking for information about my mother. The shopkeeper in town suggested you might be able to help me. This photograph says North Platte, 1858. She held it out to him. Graham stepped forward and took the photograph, his calloused fingers gentle as he held it. Ruby watched his face carefully as he studied the image. His expression shifted from curiosity to recognition, then to something that looked almost like pain. "Sarah Dawson," he said softly. "I was just a boy when she died, maybe 8 years old, but I remember her. She was kind to me, used to give me peppermints when my father brought me to town." He looked up at Ruby, his gray eyes searching her face. "She died giving birth to a baby girl. The baby survived, but there were complications. Sarah passed within hours." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes. "What happened to the baby, to me?" Graham's expression softened. "So you think you are her daughter?" It was not really a question. He handed the photograph back carefully. "I do not know what happened to the baby. There was talk that she was taken east somewhere, to family or to an orphanage. Sarah's husband, Thomas, he took her death hard. He left North Platte shortly after and never came back, sold his land and just disappeared." "Thomas Dawson," Ruby repeated, committing the name to memory. Another piece of the puzzle, though it raised more questions than it answered. "Do you know anything else about them? About where they came from, if they had other family?" Graham was quiet for a moment, considering. The sun was getting lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I know my father knew them fairly well," he said finally. "He kept journals, wrote down a lot about the people and happenings around here. They are up in the house. You are welcome to look through them if you would like." "Really?" Ruby asked, hope flaring in her chest. "I would not want to impose." "It is no imposition," Graham said, and something in his voice suggested he meant it. "You came a long way for answers. The least I can do is help you look for them." He glanced at the mare. "You rent that from old Pete in town?" Ruby nodded. "I will put her up in the barn for the night. You can stay in the guest room and head back to town in the morning. It will be dark soon, and the prairie is not safe to cross alone after sunset. Too easy to lose your way, and there are coyotes and worse out there." "I could not possibly," Ruby started to protest, but Graham cut her off with a slight shake of his head. "I insist. My mother, before she passed when I was 12, she would have had my hide if I let a lady ride back alone at dusk." There was no argument in his tone, just simple fact. Ruby found herself agreeing. partly because she was exhausted from the journey, and partly because the thought of looking through those journals filled her with an eagerness she could not quite contain. Graham took the mare's reins and led her toward the barn while Ruby followed, carrying her carpet-bag. The house was neat, but clearly the home of a man who lived alone. The furniture was well-made but sparse, and while everything was clean, there was a certain emptiness to the rooms that spoke of loneliness. Graham showed her to a small guest room on the second floor, simply furnished with a bed, a dresser, and a washstand. "I will get you some water to wash up," he said. "Supper will be ready in about an hour, nothing fancy, just stew and bread." "That sounds wonderful," Ruby said honestly. "Thank you, Mr. Lambert. This is very kind of you," he shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just being neighborly. And you can call me Graham. No need for formality out here." After he left, Ruby washed the dust from her face and hands, then changed into a simpler dress that was more appropriate for a ranch house than her traveling clothes. She brushed out her hair and repinned it, then made her way downstairs, following the scent of cooking food. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, and Graham was stirring a pot on the stove. He had cleaned up as well, she noticed, his face freshly shaved and his hair dampened and combed back. He looked younger without the beard, and Ruby found herself noticing the strong line of his jaw and the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he glanced over at her. "I hope you are hungry," he said. "I am used to cooking for ranch hands during branding season, so I tend to make too much." They sat at the simple wooden table, and Graham served them both generous portions of beef stew with thick slices of bread. For a few minutes, they ate in comfortable silence. Ruby had not realized how hungry she was until the first bite, and the food was better than she had expected. Simple, but well-seasoned and hearty. "You are a good cook," she said, and Graham looked almost surprised by the compliment. "I had to learn after my mother passed," he said. "It was either that or survive on burned beans and tough meat. My father tried, but he never got the hang of it." There was affection in his voice when he spoke of his father, mixed with an old grief. "The shopkeeper said your father passed 2 years ago," Ruby said gently. "I am sorry." Graham nodded, his expression distant. "He was a good man. Worked this ranch his whole life and built it into something to be proud of. I just try to keep it running the way he would have wanted." "Do you run it all by yourself?" Ruby asked, curious. "I have a couple of hands who come during busy seasons," Graham said. "But mostly, yes, I prefer it that way. Too much time around people makes me restless." He paused, then added with what might have been the ghost of a smile, "I know that probably sounds strange." "Not at all," Ruby said. "I spent most of my life in an orphanage surrounded by dozens of children and noise every hour of the day. Sometimes the quiet is a blessing." They talked more as they finished their meal, and Ruby found herself relaxing in Graham's presence. He was not much for small talk, but when he spoke, it was with a thoughtfulness that suggested he weighed his words carefully. There was something solid and reliable about him, like the prairie itself. After supper, Graham brought out a stack of leather-bound journals from a cabinet in the sitting room. "These are my father's," he said, setting them on the table. "He started keeping them when he first came to Nebraska in 1852. If Sarah and Thomas Dawson were around North Platte, there is a good chance he wrote about them." They spent the next few hours going through the journals together, Graham lighting several lamps as the darkness deepened outside. His father's handwriting was neat and precise, and he had indeed written extensively about the people and events of the growing town. Ruby felt a strange intimacy in reading these private thoughts, these observations of a life lived decades before. It was Graham who found the first mention. "Here," he said, pointing to an entry dated June 1857. Thomas and Sarah Dawson arrived today from St. Louis, nice young couple looking to start fresh. Thomas bought the old Miller place east of town. Sarah is expecting a child. Ruby leaned closer to read, her shoulder brushing against Graham's. Neither of them moved away. They came from St. Louis, she murmured. That is something, at least. They kept searching, and slowly a picture emerged of her parents' brief life in North Platte. Thomas had been a carpenter, skilled with his hands and quick to help neighbors. Sarah had been well-liked, known for her kindness and her beautiful singing voice. They had seemed happy, according to Graham's father's observations, excited about the coming baby and their new life. Then came the entry dated March 1858. Graham read it aloud, his voice quiet. Sarah Dawson died today after delivering a baby girl. The child is healthy, but Sarah did not survive. Thomas is beside himself with grief. The whole town mourns the loss of such a gentle soul. I do not know what will become of him or the baby. The next few entries painted a heartbreaking picture. Thomas, consumed by grief, unable to care for the newborn. Graham's mother trying to help, along with other women in town, but Thomas pushing everyone away. And then, a month later, Thomas left this morning. He said he could not bear to stay here to be reminded of what he lost. He arranged for the baby to go to his sister in Philadelphia. Said at least the child would be raised by family. We all tried to convince him to stay, to keep his daughter with him, but he would not hear it. May God watch over that little girl. Ruby felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. Graham quietly pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to her. So he did have a sister in Philadelphia, Ruby said, wiping her eyes. But I was never with family. I was in an orphanage from my earliest memories. Maybe something happened, Graham said gently. Maybe the sister never received you or could not take you in after all. It is hard to say. He left me, Ruby said, the words bitter in her mouth. My father left me because he could not face his own grief. People do terrible things when they are hurting, Graham said. Not that it makes it right, but grief can eat a person alive if they let it. They sat in silence for a while, the journals spread out before them on the table. Ruby felt exhausted emotionally, but also strangely relieved. At least now she knew something of her story, of where she came from. It was more than she had known that morning. Thank you, she said finally, looking at Graham, for letting me see these, for helping me. You are welcome, he said, meeting her eyes. In the lamplight his face looked softer, more open than it had that afternoon. I am glad I could help. I know what it is like to wonder about where you come from, to want to know your own story. Ruby found herself wondering about this quiet man who lived alone on his ranch, who kept his father's journals and tended the land with careful devotion. Do you ever get lonely out here? She asked, then immediately regretted the forwardness of the question. But Graham did not seem offended. He considered the question seriously. Sometimes, he admitted, but there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. I chose this life. I like the work, the rhythm of it. The land does not demand conversation or pretense. It just asks for honest work and respect. I think I understand that, Ruby said. Back in Philadelphia, I was always surrounded by people, but I felt lonely more often than not. Maybe real loneliness is about not being understood, not about being by yourself. Graham nodded, and something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what she meant. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Ruby woke to the sound of a rooster crowing somewhere outside. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where she found Graham already up and making coffee. Morning, he said, glancing over at her. I hope the rooster did not wake you too early. I am used to early mornings, Ruby assured him. The orphanage ran on strict schedules. They had breakfast together, and Ruby found herself reluctant to leave. There was something peaceful about the ranch, about Graham's quiet presence. But she knew she needed to get back to town to figure out her next steps. She still had to find a job, a place to stay. The money Mrs. Patterson had left her would not last forever. As if reading her thoughts, Graham asked, "What are your plans now? Are you going to stay in North Platte or head back east?" Ruby had been asking herself the same question. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I came here looking for answers about my mother and I found them, but I do not have anything waiting for me back in Philadelphia. No family, no real home. I suppose I should find work here, make a new start." Graham was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can you cook?" Ruby blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, fairly well. I helped in the orphanage kitchens for years. And clean, do laundry, that sort of thing, of course." Graham set down his coffee cup, his expression serious. "I could use a housekeeper. Someone to cook and keep the house in order, do the washing and mending. It is a lot for one person to manage along with running the ranch. I could offer you room and board, plus wages. There is a small cabin out back that was built for the previous housekeeper. It has not been used in years, but it is sturdy. Would need some cleaning up, but it would be yours, private." Ruby stared at him, not sure she had heard correctly. "You are offering me a job, if you want it," Graham said. "I know it is not much and ranch life is hard work. But you would have a place to stay, regular meals, and some independence. You could take time to decide what you want to do next. You barely know me," Ruby pointed out. "For all you know, I could be a terrible cook or lazy." "I do not think you are either of those things," Graham said calmly. "And I am a decent judge of character. Besides, you came all the way from Philadelphia on your own, searching for your past. That takes courage and determination. Those are qualities I respect." Ruby felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was the most straightforward job offer she had ever received, but there was something honest and good about it. And the thought of staying here, of having a place that was hers, even temporarily, appealed to her more than she wanted to admit. "I accept," she said. "Thank you, Graham. I will work hard, I promise." "I believe you," he said, and the slight smile that crossed his face made him look younger and more approachable. They rode into town together that morning, Ruby on the rented mare and Graham on a sturdy bay gelding. He helped her collect her trunk from the boarding house where the stage coach had delivered it, and they purchased supplies she would need for the cabin. The shopkeeper raised his eyebrows when Graham explained that Ruby would be his new housekeeper, but he was wise enough not to comment beyond a polite congratulation. The cabin, when Ruby first saw it in the light of day, was smaller than she had imagined but charming in its own way. It had a single room with a sleeping alcove, a small fireplace, a table and 2 chairs, and a window that looked out toward the main house. The previous housekeeper had left behind some basic furniture, all covered in dust and cobwebs. "I know it needs work," Graham said, looking almost apologetic. "But it is solid. I can help you clean it up." "It is perfect," Ruby said, and she meant it. This would be hers, a space of her own for the first time in her life. They spent the rest of the day cleaning. Graham proved to be as efficient at housework as he was at ranch work, and together they swept out the dust, scrubbed the floor and walls, and aired out the old mattress. Graham brought fresh linens from the main house, and Ruby made up the bed while he checked the fireplace to make sure the chimney was clear. By evening, the cabin was transformed. It still needed curtains and personal touches, but it was clean and cozy. Graham had even brought over a small vase of wildflowers and set them on the table, a gesture that touched Ruby more than she expected. "Welcome home," he said simply, and then left her to settle in. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the cabin, Ruby listened to the sounds of the prairie. The wind rustling through the grass, the distant call of coyotes, the gentle lowing of cattle. It was so different from the city sounds she was used to, but she found it soothing. She thought about her mother, Sarah, who had lived and died not far from here. She thought about her father, Thomas, and the grief that had driven him away. And she thought about Graham, the quiet rancher who had given her not just answers but a future. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Ruby woke early each morning and made her way to the main house, where she prepared breakfast for herself and Graham. He was usually up before her, having already done the first round of morning chores. They ate together, talking about the day's plans or sitting in companionable silence. After breakfast, Ruby would clean the house, do the washing, and prepare lunch. Graham came in at midday, often dusty and tired from working with the cattle or mending fences. He always thanked her for the meal, always asked if she needed anything. In the afternoons, Ruby would work on mending clothes, baking bread, or tending the small vegetable garden behind the house that had been neglected since his mother's death. Evenings were Ruby's favorite time. She and Graham would have supper together, and afterward they often sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. Graham would tell her about the ranch, about the land and the animals, and Ruby would tell him about life in Philadelphia, about the children in the orphanage and the city streets she had known. Slowly, over weeks and then months, they began to know each other in the way that only comes from proximity and honest conversation. Ruby learned that Graham had wanted to be a teacher when he was young, that he loved reading and often stayed up late with a book. She learned that he was more afraid of disappointing his father's memory than of any physical danger. She learned that his quietness came not from unfriendliness, but from a deep thoughtfulness, a tendency to observe and consider before speaking. Graham, in turn, learned about Ruby's fierce independence, born of years of having to rely only on herself. He learned about her kindness, the way she saved scraps for the barn cats and spoke gently to the horses. He learned that she had a beautiful singing voice, though she was shy about using it, and that she could make the simplest meal taste special with just the right seasoning. One evening in late July, a terrible storm rolled across the prairie. Ruby had seen storms in Philadelphia, but nothing like this. The sky turned an ominous green, and the wind began to howl with a ferocity that made the cabin walls shake. She was trying to secure the shutters when Graham appeared at her door, drenched from the rain that had started to fall in sheets. "You need to come to the main house," he shouted over the wind. "This cabin is not built for a storm like this. It is not safe." Ruby did not argue. She grabbed a few essential items and ran with him through the driving rain to the main house. They barely made it inside before the full force of the storm hit. The wind screamed around the house, and through the windows, they could see debris flying past. Lightning cracked across the sky in brilliant, terrifying bursts. "Come away from the windows," Graham said, pulling Ruby toward the interior hallway. They sat together on the floor, backs against the wall as the storm raged outside. The house groaned and creaked, but it held firm. Ruby realized she was shaking, and not just from the cold of her wet clothes. Graham noticed too. Without a word, he put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Ruby leaned into his warmth, feeling safe despite the chaos outside. "It will pass," Graham said quietly, his voice steady. "These prairie storms are fierce, but they move fast." He was right. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the worst of the storm passed, leaving behind a steady rain and distant rumbles of thunder. But neither of them moved immediately. Ruby realized she liked being close to Graham, liked the solid feel of him beside her, the way his presence calmed her racing heart. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming to get me." "I could not leave you out there alone," Graham said. He paused, then added, "Ruby, I need to tell you something." She pulled back slightly to look at him, concerned by the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" Graham met her eyes, and in his gray gaze she saw vulnerability and determination mixed together. "These past few months, having you here, it has changed things for me. Changed me. I know you came here looking for your past, and I know this job was supposed to be temporary, just until you figured out what you wanted. But I do not want you to leave. I do not want to go back to eating meals alone and coming home to an empty house. I do not want to wake up and not know if you are still going to be here." Ruby felt her breath catch. "Graham." "I am not good with words," he continued, the words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them out before he lost his courage. "I am better with actions, with work, but I need you to know that I care about you, Ruby. More than I have cared about anyone in a long time, maybe ever. And if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, I would like the chance to see where this could go. No pressure, no expectations, just the truth." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes, but these were not tears of sadness. "I thought it was just me," she whispered. "I thought I was imagining things or being foolish, but I care about you too, Graham, so much that it frightens me sometimes." The smile that broke across Graham's face was like sunlight after the storm. He reached up and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Ruby breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and sure. It was Ruby's first kiss, and it was everything she had imagined and nothing like she had expected. It was warm and sweet and felt like coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Graham rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I wish you had," Ruby said with a soft laugh. They sat there in the hallway for a long time, holding each other and talking quietly, making promises and plans. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside, everything felt warm and safe and right. The next morning, they inspected the damage from the storm. The cabin had held up well enough, though part of the roof would need repair. One of the barn doors had been torn off its hinges, and several fence posts were down. But overall, they had been lucky. As the summer turned to fall, Ruby and Graham's relationship deepened. They were careful not to rush things, both aware that what they had was precious and worth protecting. Graham was a gentleman in every sense, never pushing for more than Ruby was ready to give, always treating her with respect and tenderness. On a cool September evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Graham turned to Ruby with an expression of nervous determination. "Ruby Dawson," he said, taking her hand in his. "I know we have not been courting for very long by most standards, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. I want to spend the rest of my days with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, right here on this ranch. Will you marry me?" Ruby felt joy bubble up inside her, so intense it was almost overwhelming. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Graham, I will marry you." They were married in the small church in North Platte on a bright October morning in 1878. The whole town turned out for the wedding, curious about the young woman from Philadelphia who had captured the heart of their quiet rancher. Ruby wore a simple white dress that one of the women in town had helped her make, and she carried a bouquet of the last wildflowers of the season. Graham stood at the altar in a new suit, his eyes never leaving Ruby as she walked down the aisle. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Graham kissed her with a tenderness that made several of the women dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. They held a small reception at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food brought by neighbors. There was music and dancing, and Ruby sang for the first time in public, her voice clear and beautiful as she sang a love song. Her mother had written in the margins of a hymnal Graham had found among his father's things. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Graham and Ruby stood together, waving goodbye. When the last wagon had disappeared down the drive, Graham swept Ruby up in his arms, making her laugh in surprise. "What are you doing?" she asked, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Carrying my wife over the threshold," he said, striding toward the house. "It is tradition." He carried her inside and up the stairs to their bedroom. They had moved Ruby's things into the main house the week before, transforming what had been Graham's austere sleeping quarters into a true home. Ruby had made curtains and put up pictures, adding touches of warmth and femininity without erasing Graham's presence. That night, they consummated their marriage, and it was tender and beautiful and occasionally awkward in the way that first times often are. But they laughed together and loved each other, and when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, both felt complete in a way neither had ever experienced before. The first winter of their marriage was hard in many ways. The snows came early and heavy, and there were days when Graham could barely make it to the barn and back. Ruby learned to cook for a working rancher, making hearty stews and roasts that would keep Graham's strength up through long days of winter work. She learned to preserve food, to make candles and soap, to do all the things a ranch wife needed to know. But there were also moments of intense joy. Evenings spent in front of the fire, reading aloud to each other. Mornings waking up warm beneath layers of quilts, Graham's arms around her. The day Graham taught her to ice skate on the frozen pond, both of them falling more than they stayed upright, laughing until their sides hurt. In February, Ruby realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited to be sure before telling Graham. When she finally did, presenting him with a tiny pair of knitted booties she had been secretly working on, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His eyes filled with tears, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "We are going to have a baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Ruby, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Graham said. He kissed her, then knelt down and pressed a kiss to her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your father. I cannot wait to meet you." Ruby laughed, running her fingers through his hair. "We have months yet before that happens." "I know," Graham said, standing back up. "But I needed to introduce myself. Let the baby know I am here." Graham became even more protective during Ruby's pregnancy, insisting she rest more and do less heavy work. He hired one of the neighbor boys to help with chores, despite Ruby's protests that she was perfectly capable. He brought her wildflowers and read to her in the evenings, his hand often resting on her growing belly as he felt their child move and kick. In October of 1879, exactly 1 year after their wedding, Ruby went into labor. Graham rode into town at breakneck speed to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Henderson, a capable woman who had delivered most of the babies in North Platte for the past 20 years. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Graham, pacing downstairs, felt terror grip his heart. He thought of Sarah Dawson, Ruby's mother, who had died bringing Ruby into the world. He thought of his own mother, who had never quite recovered her health after his birth and had always been somewhat frail. He prayed harder than he had ever prayed in his life, but Ruby was strong and Mrs. Henderson was skilled. As the sun rose on October 15th, the sound of a baby's cry filled the house. Graham took the stairs 2 at a time, bursting into the bedroom to find Ruby propped up on pillows, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. "It is a boy, Mrs. Henderson announced with satisfaction. "A healthy, strong boy with a fine set of lungs." Graham approached the bed slowly, almost reverently. Ruby looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears and joy. "Come meet your son," she said softly. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was waving one small fist in the air. "He is beautiful," Graham whispered. "You are both beautiful. Thank you, Ruby, thank you for this." They named him Samuel Thomas Lambert. Samuel for Graham's father and Thomas for Ruby's father, hoping that in some small way they could honor the men who had come before, even if one of them had made terrible mistakes in his grief. The years that followed were full of the joys and challenges that come with raising a family on a frontier ranch. Samuel was a curious, energetic child who learned to walk early and was always getting into things. Ruby discovered that motherhood suited her, and she loved watching Samuel grow and change, seeing glimpses of both herself and Graham in his features and personality. When Samuel was 3, Ruby gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose, called Maggie from the start. She had Ruby's auburn hair and Graham's gray eyes, and she was a sweeter-tempered baby than Samuel had been, content to sit and observe the world around her. Graham expanded the ranch during those years, buying additional land and increasing the herd. He hired more hands, and Ruby found herself cooking for 5 or 6 men during busy seasons. The work was endless, but she did not mind. This was her home, these were her people, and she was building something real and lasting. On Samuel's 5th birthday, Ruby decided to take him to North Platte to pick out a present. Graham came along, making it a family outing with baby Maggie bundled up in a carrier. As they walked down the main street, Ruby noticed a new building where an old warehouse used to be. A sign above the door read, "North Platte School, opening fall 1884. "They are finally building a proper school," Graham said, following her gaze. "It is about time. There are enough children in the area now to warrant it." Ruby felt a flutter of excitement. Samuel was bright and curious, always asking questions and wanting to learn. The thought of him having a real education, opportunities she had never had, filled her with hope. That evening, after the children were in bed, Ruby and Graham sat on the porch as they often did. It was a warm summer night, the stars brilliant overhead. "You remember the day I arrived?" Ruby asked. "When I rode up to your barn with that faded photograph." "I remember," Graham said, taking her hand and intertwining his fingers with hers. "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever met, coming all that way alone to find answers about your past." "I found more than answers," Ruby said softly. "I found a home. I found you. I found a future worth remembering." Graham lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I was so lonely before you came, Ruby. I did not even realize how lonely until you were here, filling up all the empty spaces I had gotten used to living with. You brought life and love and meaning to this place, to me." "We brought those things to each other," Ruby corrected. "You gave me a family, Graham. You gave me belonging. You made me feel like I mattered." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Then Graham said, "I have been thinking about your father, Thomas." Ruby turned to look at him, surprised. They rarely talked about Thomas Dawson, the man who had left her behind. "What about him?" she asked. "I have been thinking that I would like to try to find him," Graham said carefully. "Not for his sake, but for yours, and for Samuel and Maggie. They should know their grandfather's story, all of it. And maybe, if we can find him, there could be some kind of peace in that, for everyone." Ruby considered this. She had long since forgiven her father, understanding that grief could make people do unforgivable things. But the idea of actually finding him, of confronting that part of her past, was daunting. "What if he does not want to be found?" she asked. "What if he is dead, or what if he wants nothing to do with us?" "Then at least we tried," Graham said, "and at least we know." "But Ruby, you gave me a gift by coming here, by finding your way to this ranch. Maybe finding your father could be a gift we give to our children, the gift of knowing their full story." Ruby thought about it for several days. Finally, she agreed. Graham wrote letters to contacts in St. Louis, where Thomas and Sarah had come from, and to Philadelphia, where Thomas had sent Ruby all those years ago. They hired a lawyer who specialized in finding missing persons, a man named Mr. Carson who had helped several families reunite after the war. Months went by with no news. Ruby began to think they would never find any trace of Thomas Dawson. Then, in the spring of 1885, a letter arrived from Mr. Carson. He had found Thomas Dawson living in Denver, Colorado. He was alive, working as a carpenter, and when approached about his daughter, he had broken down crying. He wanted to meet Ruby if she would allow it. Ruby held the letter with shaking hands. After all this time, her father was real, alive, just a few days' journey away. "What do you want to do?" Graham asked gently. "I want to meet him," Ruby said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I need to meet him, but I am afraid." "I know," Graham said, pulling her close. "But you are not alone. I will be with you, and so will the children if you want them there." They made the trip to Denver in early summer, leaving the ranch in the capable hands of Graham's foreman. The train ride was an adventure for the children, who had never traveled beyond North Platte. Samuel pressed his face to the window, watching the landscape change from prairie to mountains, asking endless questions. Maggie sat in Ruby's lap, content and quiet. Mr. Carson had arranged for them to meet Thomas at a hotel in Denver. As Ruby walked into the lobby, holding Graham's hand tightly, she saw an older man stand up from one of the chairs. He was in his 50s, his hair gray, his face lined with the weight of years and regret. But there was something in his features that Ruby recognized, something she saw when she looked in the mirror. "Ruby," he said, his voice breaking on her name. She nodded, unable to speak. Thomas Dawson took a step forward, then stopped, as if unsure of his welcome. "I do not deserve this," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I do not deserve to see you, to know you. What I did was unforgivable. I was a coward and a fool, and there is not a day that has gone by that I have not regretted it." Ruby felt tears on her own cheeks. "You were grieving," she said. "You lost the woman you loved. I understand that now, especially now that I have a family of my own. I cannot imagine the pain you must have been in." "That is no excuse," Thomas said. "You were an innocent baby. You were my daughter, all I had left of Sarah, and I turned my back on you. I sent you away. And then when my sister wrote to tell me she could not take you after all, that you had been placed in an orphanage, I did nothing. I was too deep in my own misery to do what was right." Graham stepped forward, still holding Ruby's hand. "Mr. Dawson, I am Graham Lambert, Ruby's husband, and these are your grandchildren, Samuel and Margaret." Thomas looked at the children as if seeing a miracle. "Grandchildren," he whispered. "I have grandchildren." He looked back at Ruby. "Can you ever forgive me?" "I know I have no right to ask, but can there be any chance of forgiveness?" Ruby took a deep breath. She thought about all the years of growing up in the orphanage, wondering why she had no family. She thought about the loneliness and the pain. But she also thought about the journey that had brought her to North Platte, to Graham, to the life she had built. Would she change any of it, even the hard parts, if it meant she had never found her way to the ranch, to the man she loved? "Yes," she said finally. "I forgive you. Not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger would only hurt me and my family. You made a terrible choice in a terrible time. but you are still my father, and these are your grandchildren. If you want to be part of our lives now, we would like that." Thomas broke down completely then, covering his face with his hands as sobs shook his shoulders. Ruby stepped forward and, after a moment's hesitation, embraced him. He held on to her as if she might disappear, and Ruby felt something in her chest ease. A knot she had not known was there loosening. They spent 3 days in Denver, getting to know Thomas. He told them about Sarah, about how they had met and fallen in love in St. Louis, about their dreams for their life together. He showed Ruby a locket he had kept all these years with a picture of Sarah inside, and Ruby recognized her mother's face from the photograph she still kept. "You look like her," Thomas said, touching Ruby's cheek gently. "You have her eyes and her smile. And when I heard you speak to your children, you sounded just like her. She was always so gentle, so kind." Ruby gave Thomas the opportunity to know his grandchildren. Samuel, with his fearless curiosity, asked Thomas endless questions about carpentry and building, and Thomas patiently answered each one. Maggie climbed into her grandfather's lap and fell asleep there, and Thomas looked like he had been given the greatest gift in the world. On their last evening in Denver, as they prepared to return to North Platte, Thomas pulled Ruby aside. "I want you to know," he said, "that I will understand if this is all I get. These 3 days, they are more than I deserve. But if you would allow it, I would like to visit sometimes. I would like to be a grandfather to Samuel and Margaret. I would like to know you, Ruby, and be part of your life." "We would like that," Ruby said. "You are welcome at the ranch anytime. It is not too late to be a family, even if it is not the family we started with." Thomas did visit, several times a year. He and Graham developed a friendship, united by their love for Ruby and the children. Thomas taught Samuel carpentry, just as he had once dreamed of teaching his own child, and he doted on Maggie, making her wooden dolls and toys. Slowly, over time, the wounds of the past began to heal. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life. Ruby and Graham had 2 more children, another boy named Daniel and a girl named Clara. The ranch prospered, and the Lambert name became well respected throughout the region. Graham was known for his fairness and integrity, and Ruby was beloved for her kindness and her willingness to help neighbors in need. Samuel grew into a young man who combined his father's steadiness with his mother's compassion. He went away to school in Omaha but always came back to the ranch, knowing that this was where he belonged. At 23, he married a sweet-tempered girl named Elizabeth from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on Lambert land, planning to take over the operation one day. Maggie became a teacher in the North Platte school, her natural warmth and patience making her a favorite among her students. Daniel followed his grandfather Thomas into carpentry, showing a natural talent for building and design. Clara, the youngest, was a free spirit who loved horses and the open prairie, and who declared she would never marry because no man could be as wonderful as her father. In the summer of 1898, Ruby and Graham celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children, now young adults, organized a party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from all over the county. Thomas traveled from Denver, now in his 70s but still spry and happy to be included in the family he had once lost. As the sun set and the party wound down, Ruby and Graham slipped away from the crowd and walked out to the small hill behind the house, the same place Graham had proposed all those years ago. The prairie stretched out before them, golden in the fading light. 20 years, Ruby said, leaning against Graham's shoulder. "Can you believe it has been 20 years? Best 20 years of my life," Graham said, wrapping his arm around her waist. He was 50 now, his dark hair streaked with silver, but his gray eyes were still as clear and steady as they had been the day Ruby first met him. "Mine too," Ruby agreed. She was 42, laugh lines around her eyes and a few silver threads in her auburn hair, but Graham still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. "You ever think about that day you arrived?" Graham asked. "When you rode up with that faded photograph, looking for answers about your mother?" "All the time," Ruby said. "I think about how scared I was and how uncertain. I had no idea what I would find here. I was just a girl from an orphanage with a faded photograph and a desperate hope." "You found your past," Graham said. "I found my future," Ruby corrected. "Yes, I learned about my mother and eventually found my father, but more importantly, I found you. I found this place, this life. I found a home and a family and a love I never imagined possible." Graham turned her to face him, his hands on her waist. "You gave me all those things too, Ruby. Before you came, I was just going through the motions. I had the ranch and the work, but I did not have a life. You brought life to this place. You brought joy and laughter and purpose. You made everything meaningful." "We made it meaningful," Ruby said, reaching up to cup his cheek. "Together. That is what I want our children and grandchildren to know. That love is not just about finding the right person. It is about building a life together, facing challenges together, choosing each other every single day." "We have done that," Graham said. "Through hard times and good, through drought and plenty, through loss and joy. We have chosen each other every day." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 20 years of love and devotion and partnership. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the party continuing, the laughter of their children and grandchildren and friends. The ranch house glowed with lamplight, welcoming and warm. This was home, Ruby thought. This was the future worth remembering. As they walked back down the hill hand in hand, Ruby thought once more about the young woman she had been, stepping off the stagecoach in North Platte with nothing but a faded photograph and hope. That girl could never have imagined the life she would build here, the love she would find, the family she would create. The photograph was still tucked away safely in a drawer, along with the locket Thomas had given her and other precious mementos. But Ruby did not need to look at it to remember her mother. She saw Sarah Dawson every time she looked at her own daughter, every time she sang the songs her mother had loved, every time she made choices based on kindness and compassion. And she did not need a photograph to remember the quiet rancher who had given her not just answers but a whole new life. Graham was beside her still, would be beside her for all the years to come. Together, they had built something beautiful and lasting out of grief and hope and love. The prairie wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of grass and sage and home. Ruby breathed it in deeply, grateful for every moment that had led her here, to this place, to this man, to this extraordinary life. She had arrived with a faded photograph and found a future that exceeded every dream. And that future was still unfolding, full of promise and possibility, for her and for the generations that would come after. Years continued to roll by like the gentle hills of the Nebraska prairie, each season bringing its own joys and sorrows. In 1902, Thomas Dawson passed away peacefully in his sleep while visiting the ranch. He was laid to rest in the North Platte cemetery, next to a marker Graham had placed years earlier for Sarah Dawson. At last, Ruby's parents were together again, separated only briefly by decades and distance, but reunited in the end. Ruby grieved for her father, but it was a clean grief, free of the complicated emotions that might have existed if they had not reconciled. Thomas had spent his final years as a beloved grandfather and a man at peace, having finally forgiven himself with Ruby's help. At his funeral, Ruby sang the same song she had sung at her wedding, her mother's song. And there was not a dry eye in the church. Samuel and Elizabeth's first child was born later that year, a boy they named Thomas Samuel Lambert, ensuring that the name and memory would live on. Watching Samuel hold his newborn son, Graham looked at Ruby and said, "We have become the ancestors now, the ones the next generation will look back on and wonder about." "I hope they remember we loved each other," Ruby said, "and that we tried to be kind." "They will remember," Graham assured her. In 1905, the ranch celebrated another milestone when Daniel completed the construction of a new barn, designed and built entirely by himself, with skills learned from his grandfather Thomas. It was a masterpiece of practical design and craftsmanship, and it stood as a testament to the talents that had passed down through the generations. Maggie married that same year to a widower named Henry Walsh, who had a young daughter. The wedding was smaller than Samuel's had been, but no less joyful. Graham walked Maggie down the aisle, and Ruby cried tears of happiness seeing her gentle daughter find love with a good man. Clara, true to her word, remained unmarried, but she was far from alone. She had become one of the best horse trainers in the region, and people came from miles around to have her work with their animals. She lived in a small house on the ranch property, independent and happy, beloved by all her nieces and nephews who thought their Aunt Clara was the most exciting person in the world. As Graham and Ruby entered their 60s, they gradually began to hand over more of the ranch operations to Samuel, though Graham still rode out each day to check on the cattle and the land. He could not imagine a life that did not include the daily rhythm of ranch work, and Ruby understood. The land was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. They had been blessed with good health for the most part, but in the winter of 1910, Graham developed a persistent cough that worried Ruby. She insisted he see the doctor in town, and after a thorough examination, the doctor diagnosed him with a lung condition, likely from years of dust and hard work. It was not immediately dangerous, the doctor said, but Graham needed to take better care of himself, rest more, and avoid overexertion. Graham hated being told to slow down, but Ruby was firm. "We have children and grandchildren who can handle the heavy work," she said. "You have spent more than 50 years working this land. It is time to let yourself rest a little." "I do not know how to rest," Graham grumbled, but he loved Ruby too much to argue seriously. He began to take life a bit easier, spending more time in the house with her, reading together in the evenings like they had done when they were first married. One evening in early spring of 1911, as they sat on the porch watching yet another Nebraska sunset, Graham said, "I have been thinking about what comes after." Ruby felt a chill run through her despite the mild evening. "After what? After us," Graham said gently. "We are not going to live forever, Ruby, and I want to make sure you know what to do with the ranch, with everything we have built." "I do not want to talk about this," Ruby said, her voice tight. Graham took her hand. "I know, but we need to. I want you to know that Samuel is ready to take over completely. The ranch will be in good hands, and I want you to know that if something happens to me, I want you to keep living. Really living, not just going through the motions. You have so much life left in you. If something happens to you, a part of me will die too," Ruby said fiercely. "You are my heart, Graham Lambert. You have been since that first day when you let me look through your father's journals. And you are mine," Graham said. "Which is why I want you to promise me you will keep going, keep loving life and our family. Promise me, Ruby." She could not bring herself to promise, not then. But she held his hand tightly and tried to memorize everything about that moment. The way the fading sunlight caught in his silver hair, the warmth of his hand in hers, the solid presence of him beside her. Graham's health remained stable for the next few years. There were good days and bad days, but he continued to be active in the life of the ranch and the family. He taught his grandsons about cattle and land management. He read stories to the younger grandchildren. He sat with Ruby in the evenings, and they talked about everything and nothing, the comfortable conversation of two people who had spent more than 30 years learning each other. In the summer of 1915, the whole family gathered at the ranch for the 4th of July. There were more than 30 people now, children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. They set up tables in the yard and had a feast that rivaled their wedding reception all those years ago. There were games and laughter, and as the sun set, fireworks could be seen in the distance from the town celebration. Graham, now 67 years old, sat in a chair that Samuel had brought out for him, watching the festivities with a smile on his face. Ruby sat beside him, and their hands were intertwined as they always were. "This is everything," Graham said softly, so only Ruby could hear. "This family, this life. You gave me everything, Ruby." "We gave it to each other," Ruby corrected, as she always did. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Graham and Ruby lay together in their room. Graham's breathing was slightly labored, as it often was these days, but he seemed peaceful. Ruby curled against his side, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I love you," Graham said into the darkness. "I have loved you from the moment you rode up to my barn with that faded photograph. I will love you beyond my last breath and into whatever comes after." "I love you too," Ruby whispered, "more than words can say." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, and in the morning, Ruby woke to find that Graham had passed peacefully in the night. He looked serene, younger somehow, the lines of pain and worry smoothed from his face. The grief that swept through Ruby was like nothing she had ever experienced. Even knowing it was coming, even having had years to prepare, nothing could have readied her for the reality of a world without Graham in it. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Nebraska. Graham had touched so many lives with his quiet integrity and kindness, and people came from all over to pay their respects. Ruby stood at the graveside, supported by her children, and tried to find the words to say goodbye. But how could she say goodbye to the man who had been her partner, her love, her best friend for more than 3 decades? Instead, she sang. She sang her mother's song one more time, her voice cracking with emotion but never failing, and she knew that somewhere, somehow, Graham could hear her. The weeks and months that followed were the hardest of Ruby's life. The house felt empty without Graham's presence. The ranch went on, run capably by Samuel, but it was not the same. Ruby found herself going through the motions, doing her daily tasks but feeling hollow inside. It was Clara who finally broke through Ruby's grief. She came to the house one morning and found Ruby sitting in Graham's chair, holding one of his old shirts and crying. "Mama," Clara said gently, kneeling beside the chair. "Papa would not want this. You know he would not." "I know," Ruby said through her tears. "I promised him I would keep living, really living, but I do not know how to do this without him, Clara. He was my whole world." "He was not your whole world," Clara said firmly but kindly. "He was a huge part of it, yes, but you still have us. You still have your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You still have your voice and your kindness and your strength. Papa gave you a future worth remembering, Mama. Do not waste it by stopping now." The words hit Ruby like a splash of cold water. Graham had given her a future worth remembering, and she was dishonoring his memory by refusing to live in it. He would want her to keep going, to keep loving their family, to keep making memories even in his absence. It was not easy, and there were still days when the grief threatened to overwhelm her. But slowly, Ruby began to emerge from the darkness. She spent more time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, about the early days of the ranch, about the love that had built everything they knew. She helped Maggie at the school, working with children who needed extra help with reading. She sang at church and at community gatherings, her voice still clear and beautiful even in her late 50s. In 1918, when the Spanish influenza swept through Nebraska, Ruby worked tirelessly to help nurse the sick. She had some immunity, having survived a mild case herself, and she used that protection to care for others. She sat with the dying, held the hands of the frightened, and sang to those who needed comfort. More than one person said that Ruby Lambert's presence was like having an angel in the room. The epidemic passed, and the family had been largely spared, though not untouched. They lost Henry's daughter, Maggie's stepdaughter, and the grief brought Maggie and Ruby even closer together as they mourned and comforted each other. As the years went on, Ruby became the matriarch of the family in truth, the one everyone turned to for wisdom and comfort. She presided over family dinners and holiday celebrations. She welcomed new babies and said goodbye to old friends. She watched her grandchildren grow up and have children of their own, the family tree spreading wider with each generation. On what would have been her 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, Ruby made a pilgrimage to Graham's grave. She was 70 years old now, her hair completely silver, her face lined with age but still beautiful. She had brought wildflowers from the prairie, the same kind Graham used to bring her when they were young. 50 years, she said aloud, placing the flowers on the grave. It has been 50 years since I stepped off that stagecoach with a faded photograph, and you gave me a future. 13 of those years without you have felt longer than all the ones we had together. But I kept my promise, Graham. I kept living. I kept loving our family and making memories. And I want you to know that not a single day has passed that I have not felt you with me. You are in every sunrise over the prairie, in every laugh of our grandchildren, in every choice I make. You gave me a future worth remembering, and I have remembered every precious moment. As Ruby turned to leave, she noticed a young woman standing nearby, clearly hesitant to intrude. She was poorly dressed, carrying a worn bag, and looked lost. "Can I help you?" Ruby asked gently. The young woman stepped forward. "I am sorry to bother you, madam. I am looking for work. Someone in town said the Lambert Ranch sometimes hires help, and I wondered if you might know who I should talk to." Ruby studied the girl, seeing in her the same desperate hope she had carried all those years ago. "What is your name?" she asked. "Jane, madam, Jane Foster." "Well, Jane, as it happens, I am Ruby Lambert. And yes, we do need someone to help with cooking and cleaning. It is hard work, but it comes with a cabin of your own, regular wages, and a place to belong if you want it." The girl's face lit up with hope so bright it nearly broke Ruby's heart. "Really? Oh, madam, I would work so hard, I promise." "I believe you," Ruby said, and she smiled, thinking of another young woman who had made that same promise so many years ago. "Come on, then. Let us go home." As they walked back toward the ranch, Ruby linking her arm through Jane's, she felt something settle in her chest. This was it, she realized. This was how the story continued. Not with endings, but with new beginnings. Not with stopping, but with passing on. She had arrived with a faded photograph, and a quiet rancher had given her a future worth remembering. And now she would give that same gift to someone else, just as Graham had given it to her. The cycle continued. Love begetting love, hope begetting hope, one generation passing their blessings on to the next. Ruby Lambert lived to be 84 years old, passing away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1942, surrounded by 3 generations of the family she and Graham had created. She was laid to rest beside Graham, her tombstone reading simply, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. She arrived with hope and gave us everything. The ranch continued on, run by Samuel's sons and eventually by their sons. The Lambert name remained synonymous with integrity and hard work in North Platte. And in the family Bible, carefully preserved alongside the faded photograph of Sarah Dawson, was the story of Ruby and Graham, written in Ruby's own hand for future generations to know and remember. It told of a young woman who came west seeking her past and found her future. Of a quiet rancher who had been lonely until love walked into his life. Of two people who chose each other, who built a life and a family through hard work and devotion, who faced joys and sorrows together, who created something that lasted far beyond their own lives. It was a love story for the ages, set against the wild backdrop of the Nebraska prairie, a testament to the power of hope, forgiveness, and the courage to take a chance on love even when the future is uncertain. And it all started with a faded photograph, and a quiet man who saw past the dust and the uncertainty to the possibility of what could be.